The restaurant sat on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in the heart of the city. From up there, the streets below looked like rivers of light. Cars moved like tiny glowing ants, and the people walking on sidewalks looked no bigger than grains of rice. This place was called the Grand View. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was a statement. The kind of place where a single steak cost more than what most people earned in a day. The kind of place where billionaires came to close deals over bottles of wine that cost more than a used car. And somewhere between those tables of silk dresses and tailored suits, there was a young man carrying plates. He was 26 years old, tall, quiet, the kind of person you wouldn't notice unless you really looked. He moved through the dining room like a shadow, refilling water glasses, clearing empty plates, and nodding politely whenever a guest snapped their fingers at him. To the people sitting at those tables, he didn't really exist. He was just a pair of hands, a uniform, a tool that brought food and disappeared. Nobody asked his name. Nobody wondered where he came from or what dreams he carried in his chest. They talked freely around him, discussing million-dollar investments, secret affairs, and family scandals, as if he couldn't hear a single word. But he heard everything, and he remembered everything too. His shift usually started at 5 in the evening and ended well past midnight. By the time he got home to his tiny studio apartment on the other side of town, his feet ached and his back screamed for rest. The apartment was small, just one room with a bed pushed into the corner, a mini fridge that hummed too loud, and a window that looked out at a brick wall. But in the corner of that room sat something that didn't belong there, a keyboard. Old and dusty, with a few keys that stuck when you pressed them too hard. He had found it at a thrift store 3 years ago, and something about it had pulled at his heart. He couldn't explain it. He just knew he had to bring it home. Most nights, he was too tired to even look at it. But some nights, when sleep wouldn't come and the silence felt too heavy, he would sit down on the edge of his bed, pull the keyboard close, and play. He always played with the volume turned low. His neighbors worked early shifts, and the walls were thin as paper. But even at a whisper, the music found its way out. It filled the room with something warm, something alive. When he played, he wasn't a server anymore. He wasn't invisible. He was someone else entirely. Someone he used to be. A long time ago. You see, this young man had a secret. A story that nobody at the Grandview knew. A story that even he tried not to think about too often because it hurt too much to remember. When he was just 7 years old, his mother had taken him to a community center for free piano lessons. She couldn't afford much, but she believed in giving her son every chance she could. The lessons were basic, simple scales and beginner songs, but something clicked inside him from the very first note. He took to the piano like he was born for it. By the time he was 10, he was performing at school talent shows. By 12, he was winning local competitions. Teachers said he had a gift. Something rare. Something that couldn't be taught. At 15, a famous music professor heard him play at a regional competition. The man sat in the back row, arms crossed, watching closely. When the performance ended, he walked straight up to the boy's mother and said words that changed everything. "Your son is extraordinary. With the right training, he could play on the biggest stages in the world." That professor helped him apply to one of the most respected music schools in the country. And, at 17, he received the letter that made his mother cry tears of joy. Full scholarship, a chance to study with the best, a golden ticket to the life he had always dreamed of. For a few months, everything felt possible. He practiced day and night, preparing for the journey ahead. His mother worked double shifts just to save enough for his travel expenses and a few new clothes. She wanted him to walk into that school looking like he belonged there. But life doesn't always follow the plans we make. 3 months before he was supposed to leave, his mother got sick. It started with a cough that wouldn't go away. Then came the fatigue, the weight loss, the doctor visits that led to more doctor visits. The diagnosis was serious. Treatment would be long, expensive, and uncertain. He was her only family. There was no father in the picture, no siblings, no relatives who could step in to help. It was just the two of them against the world. The same way it had always been, so he made a choice. He called the music school and told them he couldn't come. He thanked them for the opportunity and hung up the phone before they could ask questions. Then he wiped his eyes, walked into town, and started looking for work. He found a job washing dishes at a small diner. The pay was low, but it was something. He picked up a second job stocking shelves at a grocery store, then a third job cleaning offices at night. Every dollar he earned went toward medical bills. Every free hour he had was spent at his mother's side, holding her hand and telling her stories to make her smile. The piano became a distant memory, something he couldn't afford to think about anymore. His mother fought hard for 2 years. There were good days when she laughed and talked about the future. There were bad days when she couldn't get out of bed, but through it all, she never stopped telling him how proud she was of him. On the night she passed, she held his hand and whispered something he would carry with him forever. "Don't forget who you are," she said. "Promise me you'll find your way back to the music." He promised. But promises are easier to make than to keep. After she was gone, he drifted. He moved from job to job, city to city, trying to outrun the grief that followed him everywhere. The bills kept coming even after the funeral. Debt piled up like stones on his chest. Somewhere along the way, he ended up at the Grandview. The tips were good, and the work kept him busy enough to stop thinking. He learned to smile when he didn't feel like smiling. He learned to stay invisible. He learned to bury the music so deep inside that some days he almost forgot it was there. Almost. But every now and then, late at night, when he sat alone with that old keyboard, his fingers would remember what his heart tried to forget. Melodies would pour out of him like water from a broken dam. And for a few precious minutes, he wasn't a server who nobody noticed. He was still that boy who made his mother cry with joy. That boy with a gift. That boy who was supposed to play on the biggest stages in the world. Nobody at the Grandview knew this about him. To them, he was just the quiet guy who poured their wine and cleared their plates. But that was all about to change, because on one cold winter night, fate was about to put him exactly where he was always meant to be, right in front of a piano, with the whole world watching. Winter had arrived in the city with a cold that cut right through your clothes. The streets were decorated with lights. Shop windows glittered with holiday displays. And at the Grandview, preparations were underway for the biggest night of the year. They called it the Winter Gala. Once a year, the restaurant transformed itself into something even more spectacular than usual. Fresh flowers were flown in from overseas. The tables were dressed in white silk. Candles flickered in crystal holders, casting a warm golden glow across the room. Even the regular staff uniforms were replaced with sharper, more elegant versions. This wasn't just dinner. This was an event. The guest list read like a who's who of power and wealth. Tech founders who had built empires from their garages. Hedge fund managers who moved billions with a single phone call. Fashion icons whose faces appeared on magazine covers around the world. Even a few foreign diplomats and their security teams. Getting an invitation to the Winter Gala was nearly impossible. People waited years for a seat. Some offered small fortunes just for a chance to attend, and at the center of it all was the entertainment. Every year, the Grandview flew in a world-famous musician to perform. Last year, it had been a legendary violinist from Russia. The year before that, an opera singer from Italy. This year, they had secured someone truly special, a pianist from Vienna. A man who had performed for royalty. His concerts sold out within minutes. Critics called him a genius. Music lovers called him a living legend. He had arrived 2 days early to rehearse. A beautiful grand piano had been placed in the center of the dining room, polished until it gleamed like black glass. The staff had been warned not to touch it, not even to dust it. Everything was perfect. Everything was ready. The young server arrived for his shift at 4 in the afternoon, 2 hours earlier than usual. All hands were needed for a night like this. He ironed his uniform twice to make sure there were no wrinkles. He polished his shoes until he could see his reflection in them. As he walked through the service entrance, he could feel the energy in the building. Everyone was moving faster. Voices were sharper. The kitchen was a storm of steam and shouting as chefs prepared dishes that would cost more than most people's rent. He was assigned to the north section of the dining room, 12 tables, some of the wealthiest guests of the evening. His job was simple: pour water, pour wine, clear plates, stay invisible. He had done this 100 times before. Tonight would be no different, or so he thought. The guests began arriving at 7. Black cars pulled up to the entrance one after another. Men in tuxedos, women in gowns that sparkled under the lights, jewelry that could buy houses, watches that could buy cars. The young server moved through the crowd like a ghost. He smiled when he needed to smile. He nodded when spoken to. He kept his eyes down and his hands steady. But every now and then, his gaze would drift toward the grand piano, sitting silent in the center of the room. It was roped off with velvet barriers. A spotlight waited above it, ready to turn on when the performance began. His fingers tingled just looking at it. He pushed the feeling down and went back to work. By 8:30, the room was full. 200 guests filled every table. Champagne flowed like water. Laughter filled the air. The energy was electric. The performance was scheduled for 9 o'clock, just 30 minutes away. Behind the scenes, the restaurant manager was making final checks. The sound system was tested. The lighting was adjusted. Everything had to be flawless. Then, at 8:45, something went wrong. One of the backstage staff came running out with panic in her eyes. She grabbed the manager's arm and whispered something in his ear. His face went pale. The young server was nearby, collecting empty glasses from a service station. He watched as the manager rushed toward the back of the building, moving faster than he had ever seen him move. Minutes passed. The guests continued chatting, unaware that anything was wrong. But the staff knew. Word spread quickly through the kitchen, through the service corridors, through every corner of the building. The pianist had collapsed. One moment he had been sitting in the dressing room, reviewing his sheet music. The next moment, he was on the floor, clutching his chest, struggling to breathe. Someone had called for help immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes. They loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him out through the service exit, away from the eyes of the guests. He was alive, but he was in no condition to perform. He was on his way to the hospital. And just like that, the centerpiece of the winter gala was gone. The manager stood in the back hallway, his hands shaking. This was a disaster. 200 of the most important people in the city were sitting out there, expecting a world-class performance. The restaurant's reputation was built on moments like this. One failure could undo years of hard work. He pulled out his phone and started making calls. Other pianists in the city. Musicians who might be available on short notice. Anyone who could fill in, but it was no use. Everyone was either busy, out of town, or unable to arrive in time. 9 o'clock came and went. The guests were starting to notice. Whispers spread through the tables. People glanced at the empty piano, then at each other. The manager walked out into the dining room, doing his best to keep a calm smile on his face. He apologized for the brief delay. He promised the performance would begin shortly, but inside, he was falling apart. Back in the service corridor, the staff huddled together in small groups, watching the chaos unfold. Nobody knew what to do. The kitchen had stopped. The servers stood frozen, waiting for instructions that never came. The young server stood near the doorway that led to the dining room. From where he was standing, he could see the grand piano. The spotlight had been turned on, bathing it in warm light. It sat there waiting, silent, beautiful. His heart was pounding. He thought about all the times he had played alone in his apartment, all the melodies that poured out of him when nobody was listening, all the years he had buried his gift because life had forced him to choose survival over dreams. He thought about his mother, her voice in his memory, soft and steady. "Don't forget who you are. Promise me you'll find your way back to the music." The manager came rushing back through the corridor, his face red with stress. He looked around at the staff, desperate. "Does anyone here know how to play piano?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Anything at all. Even background music. We just need something." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. And then, before he could stop himself, the young server stepped forward. His voice came out quieter than he expected, almost a whisper. "I can play." Every head turned toward him. The manager stared at him like he had just spoken in a foreign language. "You?" the manager asked, doubt heavy in his voice. "You know how to play piano?" The young server nodded. His hands were trembling at his sides. His chest was tight with fear. But somewhere deep inside, something else was stirring. Something that had been asleep for a very long time. "I know the pieces on tonight's program," he said. "I can play them." The manager looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the empty piano. Then back at the server. There was no other option. No backup plan. No miracle waiting to arrive. "Fine," the manager said, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "You're on." And just like that, the invisible man was about to step into the spotlight. The walk from the service corridor to the grand piano was only about 50 feet. But to him, it felt like a mile. He reached down and untied his server's apron. His fingers were shaking so badly that it took him 3 tries to get the knot loose. He folded the apron and handed it to a coworker who was staring at him with wide eyes. "Are you serious?" she whispered. "You actually know how to play?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. If he opened his mouth, he was afraid nothing would come out. Or worse, he would change his mind and run the other way. The manager grabbed his shoulder. "Listen to me. Just play something. Anything. Keep it calm. Keep it smooth. Buy us some time while I figure out what to do next. Can you do that?" He nodded. The manager didn't look convinced. But there was no other choice. A member of the staff pulled back the velvet rope that surrounded the piano. The path was clear. The spotlight was waiting. 200 pairs of eyes were about to turn in his direction. He took a breath and stepped forward. The moment he entered the dining room, the whispers began. People noticed him immediately. How could they not? He was still wearing his server's uniform. Black pants, white shirt. The same outfit they had seen on the people pouring their drinks all evening. A woman at a nearby table leaned toward her husband. "Is that one of the waiters?" she asked, loud enough for others to hear. "What is he doing?" someone else muttered. A few people laughed. Not loud, mocking laughs. Just small chuckles of confusion and disbelief. The kind of laugh that says this must be some kind of joke. He kept walking. His shoes clicked against the polished floor. Each step felt heavier than the last. The piano grew closer, but it seemed to take forever to reach it. He could feel their eyes on him, judging him, doubting him. To them, he was nobody. Just a servant who had wandered too far from his place. For a moment, he almost stopped, almost turned around, almost retreated back to the safety of the kitchen where he belonged. But then, he thought of his mother. He thought of her working double shifts just so he could have a chance. He thought of her crying when he got accepted to music school. He thought of her holding his hand in that hospital bed, making him promise to find his way back. He had broken that promise for 9 long years. Not tonight. He reached the piano and stood beside it. The bench was pulled out, waiting for him. The keys gleamed under the spotlight, white and black, perfect and silent. He had dreamed of a moment like this when he was a boy, standing before a beautiful instrument, a room full of people waiting to hear him play. But in those dreams, he was wearing a tuxedo. He was announced by name. People applauded before he even touched a single key. This was nothing like those dreams. This was terrifying. He lowered himself onto the bench. The leather was cool beneath him. He adjusted his position, moving slightly closer to the keys. His heart was beating so fast he could hear it in his ears. The room had gone quiet now. The laughter had faded. The whispers had stopped. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what this strange young man in a waiter's uniform was going to do. He placed his hands above the keys. His fingers hovered there, trembling. He could see the doubt on their faces. He could feel it pressing down on him like a weight. What if he had forgotten everything? What if his hands didn't remember? What if he made a fool of himself in front of 200 of the most powerful people in the city? The silence stretched on. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Someone at a back table cleared their throat impatiently. He closed his eyes, and in that darkness, he wasn't at the grand view anymore. He wasn't surrounded by billionaires and celebrities. He wasn't wearing a server's uniform. He was 10 years old again, sitting in the living room of his mother's tiny apartment. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel, watching him with a smile that could light up the whole world. "Play for me," she used to say. "Play something beautiful." He let out a slow breath, and then his fingers touched the keys. The first note rang out into the silence. Soft, pure, a single sound that seemed to hang in the air like a drop of rain frozen in time. Then came the second note, and the third, and before he knew it, his hands were moving on their own, dancing across the keyboard like they had never stopped. He was playing Chopin, one of the most difficult and emotional pieces ever written, a piece that required not just skill, but soul. A piece that told a story without words. The music filled the room. It started gently, like a whisper, like a secret being shared in the dark. The notes floated upward, delicate and haunting. People who had been reaching for their wine glasses stopped mid-motion. Conversations that had been about to start died on people's lips. Something was happening, something unexpected. This wasn't background music. This wasn't a waiter fumbling through a simple tune. This was something else entirely. A woman at the front table felt her breath catch in her throat. She had attended concerts at the finest halls in Europe. She had heard the greatest pianists of her generation, and somehow, this young man in a wrinkled white shirt was making her feel things she hadn't felt in years. The music grew stronger. The melody rose and fell like waves on the ocean. There were moments of heartbreak in those notes, moments of longing, moments of hope that flickered like candlelight in a storm. He played with his eyes still closed. He didn't need to see the keys. His hands knew exactly where to go. They remembered everything, every note, every pause, every breath of silence between the phrases. This wasn't just a performance. This was a conversation, a confession, a prayer. He was telling them his story through the music. The story of a boy who had loved something with all his heart. The story of a son who had given up everything for his mother. The story of a man who had spent years hiding in the shadows, pretending to be invisible, while a fire still burned inside him. The guests didn't know any of this. They didn't know his history or his heartbreak. But somehow, they could feel it. The music carried the weight of everything he had been through, and it landed in their chests like something solid and real. A man near the window set down his phone. He had been checking emails when the music started. Now the phone sat forgotten on the table as he stared at the young man at the piano. A couple who had been arguing quietly in the corner stopped mid-sentence. Their disagreement suddenly seemed small and unimportant compared to what they were hearing. Even the kitchen staff had gathered at the doorway. Chefs in their white coats. Dishwashers still wearing rubber gloves. They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching through the narrow gap, unable to look away. The music built toward its peak. The notes came faster, more urgent, more alive. His hands flew across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed almost impossible. Sweat formed on his forehead, but he didn't notice. He was somewhere else now, somewhere far away from this room and these people. He was with his mother again, sitting beside her hospital bed, holding her hand as she slipped away. The final passage was coming, the part of the piece that always broke him when he played it alone in his apartment, the part that sounded like goodbye. His fingers found the notes, gentle now, slow, like footsteps walking away into the distance. The last chord rang out, soft and tender. It hovered in the air for a moment, beautiful and aching, and then there was silence. He lifted his hands from the keys, he opened his eyes, and for the first time, he saw what he had done. 200 faces stared back at him. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire room sat frozen, as if time itself had stopped. Then, from somewhere in the back, he heard a sound he never expected. Someone was crying. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but those few seconds felt like a lifetime. He sat at the piano bench, his hands resting on his lap, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. He was afraid to move, afraid to look up, afraid to see disappointment or mockery on the faces staring back at him. Then it happened. A single clap broke the silence, sharp and clear, like a crack of thunder in a quiet sky. Then another, and another. He lifted his head and saw a woman at the front table rising to her feet. Her hands were pressed together, applauding with tears streaming down her cheeks. She wasn't trying to hide them, she wasn't embarrassed. Beside her, a man in an expensive suit stood up too. Then the couple next to them. Then the table behind. One by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion, people rose from their chairs. Within moments, the entire room was standing. 200 people, billionaires, celebrities, diplomats, people who had seen the finest performances money could buy. People who were rarely impressed by anything. They were all on their feet. For him, the applause grew louder. It bounced off the walls and filled the space, until it felt like the whole building was shaking. Some people were cheering. Some were wiping their eyes. Some just stood there with their mouths open, still trying to understand what they had just witnessed. He couldn't believe it. For 9 years, he had been invisible. 9 years of walking through rooms where no one saw him. 9 years of carrying plates and pouring drinks, and pretending that the music inside him didn't exist. And now, in the span of a few minutes, everything had changed. He felt his eyes burning. A lump formed in his throat. He tried to swallow it down, tried to hold himself together, but it was no use. A single tear escaped and rolled down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He let it fall. The applause continued for what felt like forever. People didn't want to stop. They didn't want the moment to end. Something special had happened in this room tonight, and everyone knew it. Finally, slowly, the clapping began to fade. People lowered themselves back into their seats. The room settled into a new kind of silence. Not the awkward silence from before. This was different. This was the silence of respect. He stood up from the bench on shaky legs. He didn't know what to do next. Should he bow? Should he walk away? Should he go back to the kitchen and put his apron on again? Before he could decide, someone approached him. It was an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes. She was dressed elegantly, but there was something warm about her, something genuine. She walked right up to him and took his hands in hers. "Young man," she said softly, "that was one of the most beautiful things I have ever heard in my life." He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He just nodded, overwhelmed. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked. "My mother," he finally managed to say. "She gave me lessons when I was a boy. She believed in me." The woman smiled, and there was understanding in her eyes. "She must have been an extraordinary woman." "She was," he whispered. More people began to approach. A man in a gray suit shook his hand firmly and told him he had brought tears to his wife's eyes for the first time in 20 years. A young woman said the music had reminded her of her grandmother, who used to play piano in their family home before she passed. Story after story. Face after face. People who had ignored him all evening, who had looked right through him like he was made of glass, were now standing in front of him with gratitude and wonder in their eyes. He didn't know how to process it all. The restaurant manager appeared at his side, looking like a man who had just survived a hurricane. His face was pale, but there was relief in his expression. And something else too, something that looked almost like admiration. "I don't know what to say," the manager admitted. "I thought we were finished tonight. I thought everything was ruined. And then you." He shook his head in disbelief. "Where have you been hiding all this time?" "Right here," he answered quietly. "I've been here the whole time." The manager stared at him for a long moment. Then he placed a hand on his shoulder. "Well, you're not invisible anymore." Those words hit him harder than anything else that had happened that night. You're not invisible anymore. He had spent so long trying to disappear, trying to shrink himself down so small that the world would forget he existed. It was easier that way. Safer. If no one saw you, no one could hurt you. No one could remind you of everything you had lost, but hiding had come with its own kind of pain, a slow, quiet ache that never went away. The feeling of being less than, the feeling of being nobody. Tonight, for the first time in 9 years, he had let himself be seen. And the world hadn't rejected him. It had embraced him. The evening continued, but everything was different now. The guests finished their meals, but the conversations had shifted. People weren't talking about business deals or gossip anymore. They were talking about him, about the music, about how a young server had walked out of nowhere and delivered a performance that none of them would ever forget. He returned to his duties eventually. Someone had to clear the tables. Someone had to make sure the guests had everything they needed. But now, when he approached a table, people looked up. They smiled. They said thank you with meaning behind it. One man pressed a folded bill into his hand. He tried to refuse, but the man insisted. "That's not a tip for service," the man said. "That's a thank you for reminding me why I used to love music." He unfolded the bill later, in the quiet of the service corridor. His hands trembled when he saw the number. It was more money than he made in a month, but it wasn't the money that mattered. It was being seen, being heard, being recognized as something more than a uniform. As the night wound down and guests began to leave, something unexpected happened. The woman with silver hair returned. She had been sitting at one of the best tables all evening. He had poured her wine earlier without knowing who she was. Now she stood before him with a small white card in her hand. "I want you to have this," she said, pressing it into his palm. He looked down at the card. It had a name and a phone number on it. Beneath the name were the words that made his heart stop. "Director, International Music Foundation. I've spent my life finding talented musicians and helping them reach their potential," she said. "I've traveled to concert halls on every continent. I've heard prodigies and masters and legends." She paused, looking him directly in the eyes. "And I can tell you with complete certainty that what you have is rare. The world needs to hear you play." He stared at the card, unable to speak. "Call me," she said, "when you're ready. Don't wait too long." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the emptying dining room. He looked down at the card again. Then he looked at the grand piano, still sitting in the center of the room, still glowing under the spotlight. For 9 years, he had buried his gift. He had convinced himself that the music was gone, that it belonged to a different life, a different person, but it had never left him. It had been waiting. Patient. Faithful, just like his mother always said it would. He slipped the card into his pocket and felt something shift inside his chest. It was small at first. A tiny crack in the wall he had built around his heart, but it was enough. For the first time in 9 years, he allowed himself to hope. He kept the card in his pocket for 3 days. Every few hours, he would reach down and touch it, just to make sure it was still there. Sometimes he would pull it out and stare at the words. Director, International Music Foundation. The letters seemed too important to be real, like something from a dream that would disappear if he looked at it too long. Part of him wanted to call right away. But another part, a larger part, was terrified. What if she had changed her mind? What if she had gone home that night and realized she had made a mistake? What if he called, and she didn't remember him at all? He had been disappointed so many times before. Life had taught him to expect the worst. Hope felt dangerous. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong step could send you falling. But on the 4th day, something changed. He was sitting in his apartment, staring at the old keyboard in the corner. The same keyboard he had played in secret for years. The same keys that had kept his music alive when everything else had tried to bury it. And he heard his mother's voice in his mind, clear as day, gentle as always. "You made me a promise," she said. "Don't you remember?" He closed his eyes. He remembered. He picked up his phone and dialed the number. The woman answered on the second ring, and the moment she heard his voice, she laughed with genuine delight. "I was wondering when you would call," she said. "I was starting to worry you might not." "I almost didn't," he admitted. "I'm glad you did." They talked for nearly an hour. She asked about his background, his training, his years away from music. He told her everything. The scholarship he had to give up, his mother's illness, the jobs he worked to pay the bills, the silence that had followed him ever since. She listened without interrupting. And when he finished, she said something that broke him open. "You didn't lose those years," she said. "You carried them. And now they're part of your sound. That's why your music touched so many people that night. Because it was real. Because it came from somewhere deep." He didn't know what to say. So he just said, "Thank you." Within a week, his life began to change. The woman connected him with teachers, coaches, and mentors who helped him prepare for a return to the stage. He practiced for hours every day. His fingers ached, his back hurt from sitting at the bench for so long, but he didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt alive. He quit his job at the Grandview. The manager understood. In fact, the manager shook his hand and told him it was the right thing to do. "You don't belong here," the manager said. "Not in a cruel way. In a kind way." You never did. Months passed. He performed at small venues first. Private gatherings, charity events. Each performance was a step forward. Each audience was a little bigger than the last. Word began to spread. People talked about the young man who had appeared out of nowhere with a gift that took their breath away. Articles were written. Videos were shared. His story traveled from person to person like a song that couldn't be forgotten. And then, almost exactly 1 year after that night at the Grandview, he received a phone call that changed everything. He had been invited to perform at one of the most famous concert halls in the world. He almost dropped the phone when he heard the news. This was the stage he had dreamed of as a child. The stage his mother had always believed he would reach. The stage that had seemed so impossibly far away. Now it was real. The night of the concert arrived faster than he expected. He stood backstage, dressed in a black suit that fit him perfectly. His hands were shaking, just like they had shaken a year ago at the Grandview. But this time, the fear was mixed with something else. Gratitude. He thought about all the people who had helped him get here. The woman who had believed in him when she didn't have to. The teachers who had pushed him to be better. The strangers who had shared his story and cheered him on from afar. And most of all, he thought about his mother. She wasn't here to see this moment. She would never sit in the audience and watch her son take the stage. That thought still hurt. It would always hurt. But in another way, she was here. She was in every note he played. Every melody he remembered. Every breath he took before his fingers touched the keys. She had given him this gift. And tonight, he would share it with the world. The lights dimmed. The crowd fell silent. A voice announced his name. He walked out onto the stage. The concert hall was enormous. Thousands of seats stretched out before him, filled with people who had come from all over to hear him play. The grand piano sat in the center of the stage, gleaming under the lights. He sat down on the bench. He placed his hands above the keys. And just like that night at the Grandview, he closed his eyes and let the music carry him away. He played for nearly 2 hours, piece after piece. Some were joyful, some were sad, some were so powerful that people in the audience openly wept. When he finally lifted his hands from the keys, the silence that followed was absolute. Then the applause came, louder than anything he had ever heard. The entire audience rose to their feet. People cheered. People cried. People held their hands over their hearts like they had just witnessed something sacred. He stood and bowed. Tears streamed down his face. But he didn't hide them. He let them fall, just as he had let them fall a year ago. This was who he was. This was who he had always been. And now the whole world knew it. After the concert, as the crowd slowly emptied and the stage lights dimmed, he made a quiet decision. Every year, on the anniversary of that winter gala, he would return to the Grandview, not as a guest, not as a famous musician demanding special treatment. He would return to play, for the staff who had watched him walk out of the kitchen that night. For the guests who had doubted him and then believed. For anyone who needed to be reminded that greatness doesn't always come from expected places. He kept that promise. Year after year, he returned. He would walk through the same doors he had once entered as a server. He would sit at the same piano that had changed his life. And he would play. The restaurant never charged for those performances. They didn't need to. People came from all over just to be in the room. Just to hear him. Just to witness the miracle that had started in that very spot. And every time he played, he thought of his mother. He thought of her working double shifts so he could have lessons. He thought of her crying when he got accepted to music school. He thought of her holding his hand in that hospital bed, asking him to make a promise. He had kept that promise. He had found his way back to the music. And somewhere, wherever she was, he knew she was listening. He knew she was proud. The boy who had been invisible was invisible no more. He had stepped into the light. And he had shown the world something important. Something that people needed to hear. That dreams don't die just because life gets hard. That gifts don't disappear just because we stop using them. That it's never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. All it takes is one moment of courage, one deep breath, and the willingness to let your hands touch the keys.